This time we're looking at Genesis chapters 10 and 11. Chapter 10 is a fairly simple breakdown of the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. I assume that's going to become relevant again later on. Chapter 11 is then a very short bit on the story of the Tower of Babel, and the other half is a lineage going from Noah's son Shem down to Abraham. There's an interesting part in this. It's not actually mentioned specifically, but the ages given in the lineage in chapter 10 suddenly have fallen down from being Noah at 950 being not untypical. Suddenly everybody's living to more like 400 and they're having kids in their 30s. So a lot closer to normal than it has been. And the second part in chapter 11, it just leaves out all the ages from the lineage at all. So whilst it's not specified, I wonder if this is the beginning towards normalisation of people's ages. There's another interesting factor in that at this point we are, roughly about 30% of the Bible so far is a list of these lineages. I've sort of been missing the point on these, I think, because I'm largely skipping over them. Maybe they become relevant later on. But given it's 30% of the first 10 chapters of the Bible, it's quite a sizable chunk. First 11 chapters, sorry. It's quite a sizable chunk. The events of the Tower of Babel, it seems, take place somewhere around 400 years after Noah, so we've got nothing really in between in terms of what's happening, but it sounds like things are going much better than they were before. And the story of the Tower of Babel itself is actually only half a page, so it's not a big thing, but again it's looking like a metaphorical rather than literal account. So we're going to have to dig deep to see if we can find the moral of the story. In the short version, this is descendants of Noah all congregating together, cooperating, all speaking the same language and building this great city with a massive tower. I'd always understood that this was a tower that was intended to reach the heavens, and God didn't like that, so he stopped them doing it, basically. But there's no mention of that at all in the Bible. In fact, God's objection, as it's written down, appears to be more on the lines of he doesn't like people being all close together, working well together. It actually even states in verse 6 of chapter 11, the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, they will not understand each other." It's not clear why God has an objection to that. And you think if the issue is great architectural projects, then there's been some pretty serious ones since then. And what do you think of the moon landing? That's a great effort of cooperation between lots of people. It's interesting this when you think of it in the context of Adam and Eve, and part of the punishment for the disobedience there was that putting enmity between people, which would seem to drive a wedge between people in some sort of attempt to stop people collaborating quite so well. And then this story again has that same sort of God comes down, garbles all their language. It's not quite clear what that means. I don't know if it's the introduction of different languages, and this is where the term to babble comes from. So these people couldn't understand each other, so they all separate and go off elsewhere and spread out. So it seems God had wished for everybody to, keeps being mentioned, of go and be fruitful, as in to breed, and for people to spread out and populate large areas. And it seems they haven't been doing that. They've all been collaborating. It's just odd. That seems like a good thing. That would seem like people working together, but clearly that is not what God wanted in that context. So it was pushed to no longer be a thing. In terms of the moral of the story, that's quite a tricky one on this, isn't it? It's I can't imagine the moral of the story is that God doesn't want people cooperating. Perhaps it's an explanation for where all the different languages have come from. If it was theoretically true that everyone came from one place in terms of Adam and Eve, then all destroyed, then all from Noah, presumably everyone would have the same language, and yeah, sure, it would evolve a little bit over time. But it does seem that the intent here is to drive difference in people in terms of language and to scatter them. So I guess it is important to God that people do spread out, and that must have some sort of bearing on the future, but it's not clear at all from here what that intention is. As I said, the second half of chapter 11 is just a lineage from Noah's son Shem right down to Abraham, and that's where we'll pick up with the next one. It's a bit of a weird story, that next one, so that's quite a big story, so that's going to be an interesting one to get stuck into.